All right, I'm Sandy Evans. I'm from the University of Southern California, and I'm also here with my colleague Matt Weber from Rutgers University. We're going to be co-presenting. Our project is about the emergent structure in a social movement. We're looking at Occupy Wall Street. So our talk today will cover a brief overview of the Occupy Wall Street movement, just to refresh your memory, the theoretical perspective that we're using in this project, our data and methods, our results, and some of our concluding thoughts and what we're going to do next. Okay, so Occupy Wall Street began around June 2011, and it stemmed from the media organization Adbusters, and then it gained a lot of ground as a social movement in the fall of 2011. You may remember that the physical occupation kind of got started in Zuccotti Park in New York City, and it took flight from there. So there was the formal occupation of Zuccotti Park. The movement spread across the US to different cities and towns, and it also had an international presence. Now, early on, you could see some qualitative organizational dynamics emerging within this social movement. It was a self-described leaderless movement, as many social movements are, but there were still organizational dynamics, such as the physical centers, usually city or region-based. There were organized groups within the movement, so you had libraries, you had decision-making bodies like the General Assemblies, you had communication, rituals, procedures, jargon, and strategies. For example, the meetings were, since they couldn't use a bullhorn, the speaker would say something and it would get repeated by the crowd. Now, these tactics weren't necessarily new from Occupy Wall Street. Some of these were stemming from past movements, but these were organizational dynamics that could be observed. And then there was also the coordination of movement, physical movement, activities, and rules. We're looking at Twitter data, so you can see a theme in this presentation or these set of presentations. Social media was utilized as a major tool for the movement. The first mention of hashtag Occupy Wall Street occurred in July 13 of 2011, and at its peak there were an estimated 486 Occupy hubs globally. And at least 241 distinct hashtags have been recorded, but that number varies depending on what data source you look at. So Twitter was germane to this movement. It was very important to this movement, as were other social media tools like Facebook. And in this red box here, you don't have to read the whole thing. What this is, these are rules for the Occupy Austin movement about ways you can use Twitter to promote the movement. So for example, it starts out by describing what hashtags can do, which is categorizing messages. And then it talks about you can put them anywhere in the message. The most important hashtags to us are hashtag OWS, hashtag Occupy Wall Street, and it even gives an example of the police thought our puppet of their chief was hilarious. We have to do this again. Hashtag Occupy Wall Street, OATX. So there are even organizational dynamics behind the use of Twitter in some locations. And one thing that we're also pulling out in this project is the relationship between Twitter and news media. This is a chart that is diagramming the relationship between hashtag mentions and US mainstream news coverage. So what you have the Twitter mentions up top, and then on the left you have mainstream US newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, etc. And it's hard to see, but those are front pages of the newspapers. The red pieces of the front pages are where Occupy Wall Street was mentioned. And what this graph shows is that there seems to be some sort of correlation between the mentions on Twitter of these hashtags related to the movement and front page coverage. So there's a slight lag going from Twitter to mainstream media coverage in some ways. So we wanted to explore this relationship between media further. So social movements, this is the foundation of Occupy Wall Street. They can be defined as actors that are engaged in a social conflict who share a collective identity while maintaining organizational or individual identities, and who exchange practical and symbolic resources through informal networks. So we're really taking a kind of network perspective on social movements because networks are important in terms of information and resource exchange for collective action. We have a multi-theoretical approach to this project. So as I mentioned, we're taking this network and social movement perspective where networks are central to social movements because they link different types of nodes. And nodes can be many things. They can be participants, they can be organizations like formal nonprofit organizations, they can also be media and communications technologies. We are also arguing that links between actors and technology are increasingly relevant, and a way to frame this type of argument is to look at actor network theory, because this is a way to get beyond just networks of actors, of individual people, and to look at the relationship between people and technology at a more equal level. And then finally, the interaction between actors and hashtags collectively represent a networked form of organization. And so the theories about what constitutes organization and networked forms of organizations, for example, Woody Powell's work, is very central to our topic in this paper. So for what we did in this, for this conference, we tested 2 hypotheses and a research question. So our first hypothesis is that over time, clusters within an emerging network organizational form will be increasingly interconnected. That over time, dyadic communication will become prevalent in an emerging network organization. And then our research question, which is, how is the Occupy movement reflected in mainstream news media in terms of the amount of coverage over time? So you can see from our questions, we're looking at the dynamics of Twitter over time, Twitter networks over time, as well as the relationship between Twitter and news media coverage. So to give you a quick descriptive visual, we have 2 networks from Social Flow that kind of mapped out what was happening in Twitter at 2 points in time. And at first, you can see the movement early on. This is based on centrality, and the larger the node, the more influential the node is here. And so you can see Adbusters was very influential early on. They kind of coined the term, and then the movement took it on a life of its own. You can also see Occupy Wall Street, New York. New York played a central role in the beginning, and then a few random people are interspersed in there. Now, a few months later, this is what the network accumulated into. And you can see Occupy Wall Street, New York is there with a strong cluster around it. Occupy Wall Street has a strong cluster. You also are starting to see regional locations like Occupy LA, as well as mainstream news media figures like Keith Olbermann and a range of other entities emerging, even like New York Times Metro. So from here, we're going to go into our data. And so I'll pass the mic over to
All right, the anchor leg in this marathon session, so I appreciate everyone sitting tight, kind of shake your arms out and get the blood flowing as we dig into the data. So what you're seeing up here, to kind of build off what Sandy was saying, are the connections around the hashtags, the connections that formed around the different centers of organizing. And you see, beyond just the Occupy movement, you're also seeing the interplay between Occupy and the media. You can see media actors such as Keith Olbermann coming into this picture. So there's that interplay as well already starting to emerge just in looking at the visualizations in the data. So as we've started to dig into the data, we're taking a slightly different approach to this than what you see in Social Flow. We're dealing with Twitter data. We're really focusing on the connections that were formed between people and trying to discern what type of organizational structure has emerged here. We're interested in the connections that actors within this network were forming to one another. So in terms of data, this Twitter data was collected through a Twitter Firehose, a whitelisted account that allowed us through the Annenberg Innovation Lab at USC to stream in fairly massive amounts of Twitter data around the Occupy Wall Street movement. We have ID numbers for users. We have tweets posted by each user, the time of the post, other users that were mentioned in a post, the number of followers users followed. So we have some nice attributes that we can include as we try to discern which users we want to focus in on and the roles that different users are playing in this network. In addition, we wanted to look at the role of media, so we've collected some additional complementary data on media coverage of the Occupy Wall Street movement. We did a search of LexisNexis of 105 major US newspapers, focusing on the search terms Occupy Wall Street, Occupy LA, Occupy OWS, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Chicago, and Zuccotti Park, trying to capture some of the coverage that ran in parallel with what we were seeing in the Twitter data. The analysis that I'm going to talk about in the slides that follow focus on a sample set that was drawn from October 17th, 2011 to January 1st, 2012. In that time period, we collected through this fire hose of Twitter data 750,000 tweets around a sample set of hashtags. Within those 750,000 tweets, we had approximately 350,000 users and 35,000 hashtags that were collected. Not all of those hashtags were the ones that we were focusing in on. Those are simply the hashtags that were collected in this data. The results that I'm going to present focus on two specific dates. So we're going really narrow for this initial snapshot. So we're looking specifically at November 10th and November 17th, looking at the Occupy LA movement with this sample. And I'll say a bit more about why we've made this cut as I move through the data. All right, so as I said, we're focusing on network created by mentions, @you within the tweet. So that's where you use the @ symbol to indicate that you're pointing to somebody else, that you want to talk to another individual, talk about another individual. If you're retweeting, if you're using that RT, and then you're indicating that you retweeted something somebody said. In some way, it's indicating an interaction with another individual. For the two dates that we're talking about, we saw roughly 2,801 individuals on November 10th, and then 3,892 individuals on November 17th that were part of this Occupy LA network. This was a total merged data set of 5,402 individuals. And here you just see a real simple visualization of what these Twitter networks look like. You can't tell a whole lot when you look at this type of diagram. Network scientists, we love our pretty pictures, but what you can start to see is that there are some layers of interaction. There is certainly a disconnected ring on the outside. That ring on the outside tends to be people who tweeted, were retweeted by somebody else, but those two people, or mentioned somebody else, but those two people aren't really part of the core of the network. You do see a very clear and defined core. So again, important to keep in mind here, we're looking at mentions. So think about Twitter. Who here's on Twitter? Get hands up, get blood flowing. Who here has retweeted? Who here has used the @ symbol? Who here has used the @ symbol to point to somebody else in this room? So you can start to see that there are people in here who have connected with others, and we're kind of a biased sample because hopefully or theoretically many of us know each other, but you can see, or I can see, that we narrowed down that sample a little bit to this core that is connecting with one another, and that's what we're looking at in here. All right. So our methods for analyzing this data. We started first with an initial network analysis to simply look at the structure of the data to understand the types of communication configurations that existed within this network. We then moved on to do a longitudinal social network analysis where we're comparing the 2 points in time. And we have some interview data that we're starting to collect now to add a qualitative portion to this data. And our ultimate goal is to be able to align the qualitative and the quantitative to tell this story about emergent organizational structure within this social movement. So looking simply at the structural data, what you're seeing here are results from an analysis that was conducted in the StatNet statistical analysis package using exponential random graph modeling. What these parameters tell you essentially is the likelihood that you're going to see certain communication behaviors. So for instance, mutual would indicate that there's a likelihood that if I mention @ somebody, that person is going to mention or did mention @ back at me. There was reciprocity. Triangles, triadic communication structures. Likelihood that those types of communication structures were going to occur in this network. And you see the results for November 10th and November 17th. So what you see here is that the results show that for reciprocity and for triadic communication, these are a positive and significant part of each of these communication networks. You start to look at this and you say, okay, there's reciprocity, there's triadic communication. It might be increasing over time, because if you look at the numbers for November 17th, they're slightly bigger, but you can't really compare these two data sets. On top of this, the data fit generally well. We compared in-degree and out-degree simulated over time to show that there was a generally well-fit model for both time frames. But again, keep in mind, you can't really compare networks this way because they are two different distinct data sets. What we did use to compare data sets was the RCNA package, which allows you to look at the change in these parameters from time 1 to time 2. So we used the initial analysis to get an idea of what parameters existed in this network, and we're now using RCNA to get an idea of the change in the networks over time. This is a pretty basic analysis, and part of why we narrowed down to the Occupy LA movement is that this is computationally tough. This one simple analysis run on Amazon Elastic Computing took 48 hours to compute these parameters and reach convergence. So we're trying to think strategically about ways to expand this analysis. But what we do see here is that over time, reciprocity and the likelihood of forming reciprocal ties grew and was significant. So in this 1 week time frame, we saw an increase in the likelihood that people would have reciprocal ties with one another. During this time frame, the Occupy LA movement was organizing itself for a major rally on November 17th. So they were really coalescing the movement, trying to bring together different members of the organization. And as they were going through that process, we see this growth in reciprocal ties. On top of that, going beyond even reciprocity, we saw an increase in this clustering, this formation of these triadic signatures. So if I communicated with two people, there was an increased likelihood that those two people would then talk to each other via Twitter. So again, this coalescing and formalizing of the organization, at least at an initial snapshot, looking at the Occupy LA movement during this critical period of their development. In addition, we have collected, as I said, the news data. We haven't done much in the way of analysis with this data at this point, but you do see a spike aligning with the November 10th to 17th period that we were looking at with Occupy LA. The news coverage seems to lag a bit. And there is some work in the ecological literature on legitimacy that would suggest that that increase in news coverage is acknowledging perhaps the legitimacy of the movement, the legitimacy of that particular form of organizing. So there is some suggestion that there is a connection between news coverage and what we're seeing in the Twitter data, but we have a bit more work to do there. So ultimately what we see here is perhaps some suggestion that there is a corporatization of Occupy Wall Street. Tweet that, don't tweet that. I'm not sure how people will take that. But what we're suggesting here is that as you look at the Occupy Wall Street movement over time and start to break down the communication structures that exist within Twitter, there are communication structures that are very reminiscent of what you might see in a corporation. There's a hierarchical organizational form. We see this qualitatively as well as we start to look at the way in which these hashtags are created. You saw the example that Sandy showed of the instructions from the Occupy Austin movement. So there are some suggestions here and some indications that there is a hierarchical structure here. As we move towards the future with this work, we're going to start expanding the number of centers within the Occupy movement that we're looking at. We also are trying to think about how we can start to connect the different centers, Occupy LA, Occupy Austin, Boston, New York, to see what coordination occurred between the centers. We would also like to be able to compare this data against corporate data. For instance, we've been bouncing around this idea of looking at email networks and trying to see if there are similar communication parameters, structures within those email networks that match against what we're seeing within the Twitter data. Again, trying to show this corporatization of these types of emergent social movement communication structures. So with that note, I'm about out of time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, we're happy to take them.
Thank you very much.